I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people as the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm joining you today. But I'd also like to recognise that we're gathering to talk about a project that is grounded in Melbourne's west, which also includes Boonwurrung and Wadawurrung country. We recognise that this land always has been and always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. We recognise our continuing connection to the land, waters and culture, and pay our respects to their elders past and present. For those who I haven't met yet, my name is Susie Moloney and I'm the Executive Director of Jesuit Social Services Centre for Just Places. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today to really celebrate and kick off the next phase of what has been a 12-month project, mobilising climate just and resilient communities in Melbourne's west. We're so grateful to so many of the people and organisations who are joining us today and for the many contributors across this project over the last 12 months. We'd like to recognise also the significant funding and support provided by the Gandel Foundation and the Victorian Government to enable Jesuit Social Services Centre for Just Places to, borrowing the vision statement of Gandel, to undertake initiatives that create a positive and lasting difference in people's lives. Importantly, I'd like to recognise the immense contribution of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation in funding and supporting this initiative, and many others, by supporting groups to tackle the root causes of social, economic, environmental and health inequities. Also special thanks to Dr Catherine Brown, who's Program Manager of the Healthy and Climate Resilient Communities Impact Area at LMCF, for continuing to champion this critical work across Victoria. Also acknowledging our project partners, Brimbank, Hobsons Bay, Melton, Wyndham City Council, as well as Gen West, IPC Health, Network West, the Victorian Council of Social Service, as well as the Victorian Department of Health. And also finally, just to acknowledge the fantastic work of our project leads, Katrina Dunn, who is currently on paternal leave, and Andrea Wolf. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we start. We're recording this event so that those who can't join us live today will be able to watch it back later. We also have live transcription, and if you'd like to use subtitles, please enable them by selecting the live transcript button on your Zoom control panel. These subtitles don't always work perfectly, so a member of our team will be correcting transcript errors in the chat. And please feel free to post your comments in the chat through the event, and if you'd like to ask a question, please do so in the Q&A function. So the overview of today, we have 1 hour and we've got a little bit to get through. And we're going to hear from Dr Catherine Brown OAM and Julie Edwards as the Chief Executive Officers of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation and Jesuit Social Services, respectively, who are really going to open to reinforce the importance of this work, particularly for the community sector. I'll run through the collaborative action plan, sharing with you an overview of the process and the outcomes, and then I will be in conversation with 3 panellists who've been involved in the project since the beginning. Ben Latham, who's the Policy Advisor from VCOS on Climate Equity, Tess Stewart-Moore, Health Promotion Project Coordinator from Gen West, and Melissa Grimes, Social Planning Officer from Melton City Council. And then we'll open up for questions at the end. So I'd just like to begin by introducing Dr Catherine Brown OAM, who's the CEO of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation. Catherine is a leader committed to social change and innovative philanthropy. With a background in law, Catherine has held many senior roles within the not-for-profit and philanthropic sector. She joined the foundation in 2011 and was awarded an OAM for services to charitable organisations in 2020. Thanks so much, Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Susie. I'd first of all like to acknowledge that I'm joining you all from Wurundjeri country and pay my respect to elders past and present, and noting that this covers a wider area than that, and we might come back to that. I'd also like to acknowledge Julie Edwards as the CEO of Jesuit Social Services, who, as we all know, is an outstanding not-for-profit leader. First of all, obviously the Foundation is very proud to have supported this work and to have this action plan produced. And I thought it might be interesting to just provide a bit of context of why we are so passionate about climate justice and working on our whole climate transition. So we are a community foundation, and we're basically the community foundation for Greater Melbourne since 1923. And we, over the years, have aimed to basically address the big challenges of the day. And in 2016, we placed a climate lens across all our work. So we didn't see the impact of climate change as being something in one part of our work. We saw it actually impacting everything. And I think that's certainly been proven true. And just to give some examples, when we fund an affordable housing project, we expect it will be highly energy efficient and climate safe design. When we support social enterprises, we're really focusing a lot on developing opportunities in the green and clean economies. We've supported Foodprint at the University of Melbourne for 7 years to map Melbourne's food bowl and address our food system resilience. And then in the health area and in disaster response, we've worked on health impacts of climate change, especially heat waves, and of course many more. But you can see the idea of a lens, a climate lens, is to say, in this work we're supporting, can we reduce emissions or can we increase resilience? We're actually particularly concerned about addressing economic inequality and disadvantage. And we've taken this lens to our climate work in most instances. Recently, we've supported ACOS's work on a just transition, which I think will be very important at the national policy level. And for quite a number of years, we've worked on the Hotspots initiative, which was one of our first steps in climate resilience work, where we supported Enliven in Dandenong, IPC Health in Brimbank, CoHealth in Inner Melbourne, and later Banksia Gardens to work with vulnerable residents to prepare for heat waves. This work is critical because, as we know, we've got very bad record on heat waves, and they do kill more people than any other natural or other disaster. The stats, as we know, the two worst heat waves on record were 2009 and 2014, and in January 2019, Australia recorded its hottest ever month on record, and we could go on with those stats, so we all know what we're dealing with. We're also the founder of the development of a collaborative for community climate resilience, which we're working on with FRRR, Emergency Management Victoria, and VCOS, and that project is creating a hub of information and resources for local community groups wanting to learn and implement local climate resilience networks. So, I mean, I could go on, I could probably talk underwater about our work on climate change, but you can see the context that this project, the Mobilising Climate Resilient and Just Communities in the West project that is being presented today, it really is an excellent next step in the work that we've been funding. And it was supported through the Climate Change Resilience in the West initiative, which aimed to support resilience building and emissions reduction efforts that are healthy, just and regenerative for the people and environment of Melbourne's West. And as Susie mentioned, this work has been led by our wonderful program manager, Dr Catherine Brown. So Melbourne's West is Wurundjeri, Bunurong and Wadawurrung country, and has diverse, capable and creative communities. And the region has strong foundations for climate change resilience. But because of complex challenges and the opportunities for the West, we're especially focused on working with communities across that region. So we do work across Greater Melbourne, but in some of this climate resilience work, we are really giving the West a lot of attention. For example, we currently support Network West, a network of 55 neighbourhood houses working on climate resilience plans. So I wanted to congratulate Jesuit Social Services Centre for Just Places, led by Susie Moloney, for their fantastic work bringing together such a broad range of community service and health organisations, along with local and state government agencies, to continue this project. And I would also like to acknowledge all the participants for their commitment and their insights. Understanding and tackling climate justice takes diverse perspectives and skills, particularly those who already understand social justice and issues of equity, working alongside people with environmental expertise, and really across many, many sectors, as we've already talked about, with health and employment and housing, etc. So cross-sector collaborations are essential to building climate resilience, and they are really creating community infrastructure that will help, that will protect communities, into the future. So we're looking forward to continuing to work with partners in the West Network, and we're talking about what role we might play as we continue to deepen this work. And I did want to mention that we will be launching a new initiative, the Climate Resilient Neighbourhoods Initiative, in 2023, and Karen will be providing more information to the sector about that. So that's really my message, and congratulations to everybody who's worked on this. And I commend the plan to everybody and very much look forward to what comes next. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Catherine, and thank you also for the enormous support. And there'll be a lot of organisations who really value the leadership that your organisation provides on climate and resilient communities. Thank you. Now I would like to introduce Julie Edwards, who's the CEO of Jesuit Social Services. Julie is passionate about finding ways to give practical expression to her social justice values, exploring the most effective means to build a more just society, and promotes a value-based model of leadership. Julie has been the CEO of Jesuit Social Services since 2004. Thank you, Julie.
Thanks very much, Susie, and thanks, Catherine, too, for your kind words. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands we're joining from today. For me, Wurundjeri land, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and express gratitude for the care of land and water and community. And of course, in a forum like this, where we're acknowledging the deep importance of place, it's important that we can come back to that sense of gratitude and know about that care, which I hope is the basis of our own connection together today for what we're trying to pull off. I'm grateful to all of you for being present, and particularly wanted to thank our partners in this and those speakers today for sharing your expertise. So yes, today we are gathered to launch the Collaborative Action Plan. Before I just talk about the significance of that wonderful collaborative effort, I just wanted to say a little, in a similar way that Catherine has, to share a bit about our journey here, because I think it's very significant. We are still learning, and there is a lot to learn. We started off 45 years ago. It's our anniversary this year. And we started working with young people in the criminal justice system. And we've continued that relationship with them, young and people across the lifespan in the criminal justice system. And the way we work at Jesuit Social Services is by building relationship. And as we built relationship with people caught up in that cycle, in and out of prison, and we listened and we learned, of course, that many of them come from a handful of postcodes that bear the burden of disadvantage in this country. We learned that they have been often excluded from school. We learned about the highly gendered nature of violence, and 93% of those in custody are men or male. And we learnt about the prevalence of mental illness and of substance abuse, etc. We also learnt, as I say, through our postcode disadvantage research, dropping off the edge, that people get caught in a web of disadvantage. And as we listened and learnt, and we looked at the world around us, we noticed that, of course, it wasn't solely what we had been looking at, which is the social risk factors, but these locations were also faring more poorly around environmental risk. And so last year, when we did our dropping off the edge research for the 5th time, we added a number of environmental risk indicators. So I suppose that brings me to the point that I wanted to say just like I heard Catherine talk about putting that lens over all their work, we also in about 2008, but more strongly over the last decade, have put a lens of ecological justice over all our work. And what I mean by that is we've noted and we try to pay attention to the intersection of social and environmental justice. And that gave rise to us for the establishment of the Centre for Just Places, of which Susie Moloney is the executive director. So we're very grateful that last year we received funding from the Gandel Foundation and also the Victorian Government to help us explore this connection in more depth, but also to learn about and discover ways to move towards greater equity and to address the inequities of climate, of injustice, and to create communities where everyone gets to thrive. So we've been on that journey now for over a decade, and I think recent events have brought this right close to home. At an international level, Jesuit Social Services is part of an international advocacy network called Justice in Mining. And this today brings to me all the things, and knowing that COP27 in Egypt is highlighting the precarious nature of many people's existence. Well, what about in our own backyard? And I'm very grateful, therefore, that we've been resourced and funded by Lord Mayor's Charitable Fund to actually explore what's happening here in the west of Melbourne. We know that we have to act. It's becoming increasingly important. But one of the challenges is we're often very siloed in our activity. Those of us in the community sector are often picking up the failures of various systems, whether it be mental health, education, the fact that people live in poverty and are marginalised. And often that's very much first and foremost our focus, as it should be. But increasingly, we're starting to understand things like food security, the right to housing and affordable habitat, and the intersection of those and how they affect not only all of us, but in fact, some groups of people or some people more strongly, and they bear that burden of disadvantage. So as this collaborative action plan is an example of cross-sector bodies and people working together, and I just want to really affirm that we now all know none of us can do this alone, and that reinforces what Catherine said too. So these kind of alliances are a great step forward. We have a plan now, and I'm very grateful that today we are launching that plan, but of course we then need to look at what we can do to put that plan into action. Susie will speak more about the findings of the plan, but I just wanted to draw attention, I suppose, to three themes that have emerged out of that. And the first is that climate inequity is a current, lived and everyday experience for communities and community organisations in Melbourne's West. Secondly, that there is a clear call from the community sector for the need for appropriate and sustained resourcing to reflect climate justice as increasingly becoming a core part of our work, of all of our work. And thirdly, if this is collectively owned and applied across the region, the plan, which, as I say, I'm really delighted we're launching today, will provide the basis for a regional focus on the prevention and mitigation of climate risk that's needed for transformative change across Melbourne's West. It really is transformational change we're calling for. We're calling that for stepping up, because otherwise the risks of this climate change are going to outstrip what we do. So we need to really accelerate what we're doing in this domain. And so the first step for us in Melbourne and in the West, or not the first step, but a further step, is this collaborative action plan. And I look forward to working with you all to help implement that for a better future for us all. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Julie. I think you've really provided, along with Catherine, a fantastic context for for the project. I'm now going to just share some slides and quickly talk through, hopefully that is visible to everyone. So for the next 8 or so minutes, I'm just going to quickly run through the project itself, the process and the outcomes, and then we're going to move to our panel discussion. Julie's provided a good introduction to the Centre for Just Places, and as she's explained, we really have been set up to work at that intersection of social and ecological justice, and really drive and support the important work of place-based work and community-led work in addressing the issues that many communities face. Through research, action and advocacy, we are collaborating with a whole range of organisations, and this project is really an example of that type of work that we have really been helping to support and drive. So just to provide some context for this particular project, as we said, it's focusing on the west of Melbourne. And we just want to really highlight some of the particular issues and aspects of that intersection of social and ecological justice that we've been talking about. We know that there are a range of intersecting challenges across the country and in particular communities, and there are concentrations of challenges and issues that we know are happening particularly in the West. And when we talk about the implications of climate change on communities that are experiencing different kinds of marginalisation and disadvantage, we really are also highlighting that there are fewer resources necessarily to cope, adapt and recover. And so this is really what situates climate justice at the heart of this conversation. Just to provide a little bit more context around the particular experiences in the West, we know that heat in particular is an ongoing and going to be an increasing issue. And we know that climate impacts and heat are not experienced evenly across communities. And this graph here illustrates that local government areas, particularly in the West, Brimbank, Melton and Wyndham are highlighted here, are often experiencing 9 to 10 degrees hotter temperatures than other urban areas. And that can be due to a whole range of factors, including the quality of the built environment, the lack of green spaces, the lack of tree canopy cover, but individuals and others experiencing particular health issues can be further exacerbated. We also know that those living in poor quality housing that are not well insulated or are have got limited access to air conditioning, for example, or cannot afford air conditioning with the increasing cost of energy, that these also further exacerbate health and climate change inequities. And certainly that is further exacerbated in the West and in particular parts of the West. A key point in these conversations that often gets lost is the fact that the community health and community sector itself is also exposed to the impacts of climate change, and the staff and the services that they provide are therefore at risk. And with that, then we see flow-on effects further impacting communities as those services are also affected by the compounding impacts. And we're talking here about both direct and indirect impacts. For example, during heat waves and other storm events, there might be power outages, and these further exacerbate challenges. The survey that was carried out by VCOS in 2019 surveyed over 140 organisations in the community sector and really did highlight that the community sector is already experiencing the impacts of climate change in different ways. The challenge, however, is the resourcing and capacity to be prepared for those impacts, and that's really what we're focusing attention on here today. We are in the fortunate position of having strong legislative and policy frameworks in Victoria around the Climate Change Act and the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, and also the Local Government Act. And that certainly is driving further action in local governments and community sector to think about the impacts of climate change, but there's a lot more needing to be done. There's also a sector-specific adaptation action plan in the Health and Human Services adaptation plan. And this really does focus on building the capacity of the sector, and we're certainly reinforcing the need to support and implement that work. Unfortunately, we did see a decrease in funding in the recent Victorian budget, a decrease by 40% in the last budget around climate change funding, and this really has limited funding for adaptation quite significantly. So that really does frame the context for this project, and this gives you a quick overview of the processes that we undertook over the last 12 months. So we started this project in September last year, and we've worked closely with an advisory group that included 8 partners, including local government and the community sector. We also undertook a social network analysis, doing interviews and surveys, and this was really to understand what's already going on. And in taking a strengths-based approach, we are really interested in trying to build on existing networks and build on the capacities and strengths of what's already happening in the West. We also carried out a process together with Deakin University on group model building, and this was bringing 33 different organisations together for 2 workshops and then an action forum. And out of that, we really co-designed and identified a whole range of actions that the organisations themselves identified that they wanted to progress on, and that's captured in the collaborative action plan. So this really is a co-designed report and a co-designed piece of work that we are sharing and launching today. Now, we're not going into the details of what's in each section, but really this is just to give you a flavour, and we'll be sharing the links and following up with an email after this so you can download this report. But what we've done is broken the report into sections so you can download the parts that you're particularly interested in or the whole report. In the first section, we really wanted to take the time to think about what do we mean by climate justice? How are we talking about and thinking about health inequities? And what is the policy and legislative context that we're working in? And that's captured in the first summary brief. We provide an overview of the West, bringing in different sets of data, including indicators that Julie mentioned from dropping off the West and other indicators to really try and highlight some of the features and issues that are emerging in the West. Summary brief 3 is really trying to look at the existing strategic plans and initiatives that are going on across a whole range of organisations in the West, and we tried to map the sorts of themes and focus areas of those strategies. Summary brief 4 is where we really tried to capture the networks and the organisations already working in the West, as we mentioned. And 5 then is capturing the priorities and actions that were identified, and finally bringing that all together in a framework for collaborative action. And this is really the sort of synthesis or bringing together of the 5 action areas that we have developed through this process. And we've brought together a set of actions under 5 focus areas: context, communication, capacity, coordination, and consolidation. And we all were quite pleased with our 5 C's as an alliteration, and perhaps something that people can kind of remember potentially. But with context, we're really talking about the importance of doing this work with a really rich and detailed understanding of the communities in which we are working with. And so this is about ensuring that we bring diverse perspectives together to really understand the experiences and the context of climate justice issues, wherever that might be. And the intention with this framework is that any collaborative network or organisation could take this up and consider it in their own context. But certainly what we're hoping is this framework helps to drive action into the future, particularly in the West and in other areas that are experiencing particular challenges across Victoria. Around communication, the key theme that came up in talking to organisations was about how we can better communicate and share and create a shared vision for climate justice with diverse communities. And this was a really key issue in bringing different communities on board, and how we really understand this intersection and change the narrative, if you like, where we focus on climate justice as a driver of action. In terms of capacity, there's a real focus on the need to strengthen the workforce within the community sector and local governments who support communities. And this was really about ensuring that we're not operating in silos, that we're actually sharing and learning from each other and creating spaces to build our capacity to really deal with the issues and policy challenges that we know we face. In terms of coordination, this was really about recognizing that there are a whole range of frameworks around public health, around urban planning, around climate change and climate change adaptation. And it's about coordinating and bringing the objectives and the resources around these together to really inform climate justice, and also about bringing together the knowledge that we have in the sector. And finally, consolidation. And this is really, again, reinforcing the challenge around working on climate change and other social justice issues, is that they sit at the intersection of a range of policies that are often dealt with or addressed in different parts of organisations, in different parts of councils, or in different parts of government. And so it's really about ensuring that we have a consolidated approach to thinking about the intersection of issues. And I'm just coming to the second last slide here, and we'll move on to the panel just shortly. So really what we're sort of bringing a call to action for here today, and it really is trying to highlight with those who've joined this launch today and the amount of energy and effort that's been involved in this project for 12 months. It reinforces the need for this work and reinforces the need for collaboration across a range of areas. So as I mentioned, we have got the legislative and policy frameworks, but we really need the resourcing to implement and drive action under those particular frameworks. And also to strengthen those frameworks and connections. For example, around the Planning Act connected to the Climate Change Act, that's one strengthening piece of legislation that needs to happen. Strengthening the pathways for community health and community sector organisations to inform government decision-making, ensuring that there are really diverse voices and stakeholders involved in the decision-making around climate justice and climate adaptation. Strengthening place-based partnerships, and that really was something that was, I think, really valued by the organisations in this project, was the opportunity and the space to share and learn and collaborate across this 12 months and hopefully into the future. There was also a strong focus, as I said, on workforce capacity and how we build our understanding, both in terms of awareness and in training in all sorts of ways. And also the need to build evidence and understanding around climate change risks and vulnerabilities. And this is all part of the ongoing work. So this is the final visual of the strategy and the action plan, and the details are in the report. Under each of the 5 focus areas, there are a suite of priority actions, and there are also a set of resources and examples of initiatives already happening in the West that are featured in the report. So I really encourage you to have a look at that after you have finished up here. Now I am going to stop sharing my screen. And I'd like to now move on to introducing our panelists. And if you've got any questions, that was a fairly quick overview. If you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat, and please, or in the Q&A function, or if you have any comments or thoughts that you'd like to share. So I'd like to ask the panelists now to turn on their cameras, and I'm going to introduce Ben Latham, Tess Stewart-Moore and Melissa Grimes, and we're just going to have a little bit of a chat about the experience of being involved in this project and what it has sparked for you. So Ben is a policy advisor at the Victorian Council of Social Services, specialising in climate equity and wellbeing economies. Tess works at Gen West, and she's formerly Melbourne's, which was formerly called the Women's Health West organisation, where she coordinates the workforce capacity building program within the Preventing Violence Together team. And Melissa is a social planning officer at the City of Melton, which is one of the fastest growing municipalities in Australia. So really appreciate your time, and not just today, but also throughout the whole 12 months of working together. I might just open with a question that really, and Ben, I'll start with you perhaps. What did you find was most useful for you and your organisation in being part of this project, and in terms of the outcomes that it produced?
Yeah, thanks, Susie. Yeah, I guess it's working at Victorian Council of Social Service, where we're the peak body for the community sector. I think one of the biggest takeaways for us with this project was just how many community service organisations you got involved. So that was fantastic to see. I think from our perspective, when looking at climate equity, obviously community service organisations have got such a massive role to play. Like climate change is obviously impacting people experiencing disadvantage the most, and they're the people that community service organisations work with so closely. And they've got such deep trusted relationships with those people in the community. But then also community service organisations are impacted by climate change themselves. So I think it was fantastic to see so many community service organisations sort of put front and centre with this. I mean, I think about the Action Forum, which was a really great few hours where we could actually sit with community service organisations and talk to them about the things that they were seeing. I think in the community sector, spending time on climate change can be quite rare. Like budgets are stretched so thin and resources are so tight, and they're so busy delivering core services. So I think that was quite special about this project, that community service organisations were able to give up their time and contribute to this plan, and share their ideas about how to improve climate equity in the West.
Yeah, and I think, Ben, that point about the capacity and the time commitment is just can't be underestimated. I agree. Tess, what about you? How did this sort of help your thinking and perhaps your organisation's thinking?
Yeah, I suppose for Gen West, for anyone that wouldn't be familiar, we're pretty unique, I suppose, in the women's health sector, in that we provide primary prevention of violence strategies and initiatives, but we also do direct service work for people who are experiencing family violence. So I think for me, on one hand, working in gendered violence prevention, the process has been a kind of reinforcement of applying that gendered lens to kind of broad trends that we'd see in disaster or crisis. But on the other hand, yeah, I suppose when I spoke with case managers through the process, really kind of getting to understand that climate change impacts are being felt right now, just like Julie was saying. Yeah, so I think there's sort of those two hands of our service and what I've been thinking about. But I think also just coming from a prevention lens, excuse me, is the recognition that, like, you know, without addressing those sort of social determinants of health, climate justice isn't possible, and that kind of equity is a really key requirement. So I think having that emphasis on the community sector, kind of developing this work rather than, you know, promoting kind of individual efforts, if that makes sense. It's not sort of about that individual resilience, but sort of structurally attempting to mitigate climate change for our community. So I think that's been the most important thing for me.
Yeah, thanks, Tess. And I think you know, there's a lot of discussion about community resilience and what that means. And I think what you're getting at there is really that importance of taking a kind of a whole of community and a whole of society approach. And again, climate justice is about focusing on the drivers of risk and vulnerability, as you mentioned. Melissa, from your perspective in local government, can you tell us a little bit about the sorts of things that came up for you through working on this project?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Susie. Look, our world is changing, particularly out here in the city of Melbourne, which is a key part of Melbourne's Western Growth Corridor. At the same time, we're also seeing more extreme weather events, and the impacts of those climate change impacts are really cutting across, almost all areas of local government responsibility. But key for us in that is that now, more than ever, community health and community service providers are also playing a really critical role in terms of responding to what are essentially intersecting challenges around extreme weather, but also around health and wellbeing and cost of living pressures. So I think a focus for us on climate change really reveals that it's largely the existing experiences of inequality and injustice that really shape the health implications of climate change. So that really necessitates working towards climate change responses that are just and are inclusive. Useful in that is that the collaborative action plan, of course, that was produced as part of this project really has at its heart that the most effective approach, as you say, is around addressing the drivers of climate change risks and vulnerability. So mobilising climate justice really requires addressing equity across the determinants of health and wellbeing for individuals and for communities. As well as, of course, building the capacity of organisations to support communities, including during times of crisis. Thanks, Susie.
Thanks, Melissa. In terms of how, and maybe I'll begin again with you, Melissa, and go back the other way. In terms of how you're sort of seeing some of these intersecting issues and conversations happening in council or in some of the initiatives already going on out in Melton, are there some examples or initiatives that you sort of see as sitting in this particular space, or at least trying to kind of bring those connections together?
Yeah, sure. So municipal public health and wellbeing planning is tackling some of these intersecting issues that we're talking about. So around climate change, around health and wellbeing, and around broader community resilience aspects. And as you mentioned earlier, there's obviously some key statute in Victoria that really helps with that. So for example, in City of Melton, we are committed to promoting positive public health and wellbeing outcomes to our communities, and strategies are really twofold. So one is around, building capacity to adapt to the impacts of climate change, but there's also this work happening around work in partnership with health and community service providers to deliver initiatives that meet the needs of our community. And part of that is about council seeking to attract service providers in our case and working to meet the community and health needs of our diverse population. So all the while our community profile is diversifying and changing. So as you know, Susie, we already have high levels of cultural and social and economic diversity. But in City of Melton, we also have a growing population of children and young people. So I think importantly in that, community health and service organisations form like a really critical part of social infrastructure, if you like, because they have the knowledge and the networks which are really essential for responding to climate change and reducing risks. In the same sense, community centres are also really well connected. So, for example, in the City of Melton, we have the Curranjung Community Hub located next to a primary school. So essentially like a multi-purpose community facility that has an edible garden and teaching programs and so on. I mention that example because I think it's really important to enable the participation and engagement of a wide range of user groups, including children and young people. And as you say, by taking a strengths-based approach in working with communities and in organisational collaboration, that's really key. So by learning from other organisations in our region, we're also becoming part of a bigger phenomenon, and that's pretty exciting.
Thanks a lot, Melissa. And I think just it reinforces the importance of that ongoing and embedded work of communities and community organisations and leaders. just in building resilience over time, but particularly how important they are during times of crisis. And we've certainly seen that across the country in areas affected by bushfires and flooding, and closer to home too in Maribyrnong. I'll just follow up with a last question before we have a look at the questions that have come through on the Q&A. And so maybe to Tess and Ben, so what do you think we need then to sustain this collaborative engagement and work around climate justice in the West? And really sort of picking up, I guess, on some of the things that have come through in the report as well, but just from your own perspective.
Do you want me to jump in first?
Yeah, you go, Tess. Yeah.
I think for us, what's been really critical or great is that we've been able to, because the Collaborative Action Plan aligns with so many strategies that we need to align with as well. So, for example, the Health and Human Services Climate Change Adaptation Action Plan, that aligns with our Victorian Women's Health Guidelines. And so it means that we've been able to write in this work now around the Collaborative Action Planning project into our planning. So I think that in itself has been kind of critical for it to be ongoing. And of course, as you know, I think just being a part of the advisory group, there seemed to be a really strong interest in wanting to continue this work, that people have found it a very useful and very constructive process. So yeah, I think the way that it can align with the way that we plan, I think that's kind of critical.
Yeah, and I think, you know, a key issue that we really do understand, and I think came up a lot through the work, is that organisations working on the front line, as we say, are already stretched. And so what we're trying to do is build in and embed this work rather than make it an additional burden. And we're certainly also calling for that wider support to build the capacity of the sector. Absolutely, Tess. Ben, just from your perspective and your sort of overview across the community sector more broadly in Victoria, what are some of the things that that you see as being, well, I guess, a value in bringing this collaborative work together, but how to sustain it into the future?
Yeah, that's such a good question, because I think something valuable about this project was it had a lot of different phases and was ongoing over 12 months. Like, it wasn't just one event and that was it. So I think making it ongoing is really important, because we're talking about such a big issue that will take years, if not decades, to change, that transformative change we were talking about before. I think too, there's always more organisations to bring into this. I think part of the project we're talking about was building that shared understanding of what climate justice is and what the role of the community sector is too. So I think making it more people's core business, I think, would really help. And that doesn't mean extra work. It just means identifying that the community sector's core business is already building climate resilience, whether that's providing access to stable housing or providing social connections for people. So I think something ongoing that can continue bringing organisations together would be really important. I think Network West was mentioned before, and they've been running workshops for their 55 neighbourhood houses about how to build climate resilience. And that's already something that was an offshoot of this project, just by organisations building understanding of what climate resilience is, meeting great funders like LMCF, and sort of going from there. So yeah, I think anything that can continue bringing this group together at regular periods, I think would be, yeah, really fantastic. Oh, sorry, Susie, I think you're on mute.
I might, as there's always one moment when you're muted. I might move now. We've got some questions in the Q&A, and we might just spend a few minutes focusing on those, if that's all right. I mean, one of the questions from Joe Brown from the Southern Grampians Primary Care Partnership was really reinforcing the fact that community service sectors do play a major role given their local embeddedness and connection into communities. But she really is pointing to the fact that with such limited capacity, as has been discussed here, I think she's really, and I'm going to make it a collective question, she's saying, how were you able to get so many involved in this project? I mean, I guess there was a lot of legwork. There's a lot of relationship building. And I guess one of the things that really is at the heart of this work is a relational approach and the strengths that are built through establishing those relationships. But maybe just from, if anyone wants to jump in and respond to that, why was it that you felt giving your time to this, or why, from either your own selves or your organisations backing, where did you get that sort of drive and commitment from, I guess, to be involved in the project, or why is perhaps what Joe might be getting at?
Yeah, I can jump in first. I think it's such a good question. I think that's what really stood out to me with the Action Forum, was that there were so many community service workers who were attending, including frontline service workers who were able to take out time to come along and attend. But even there was one attendee who had to step out to take a meeting at the same time, just showing how busy people's schedules are. I think in talking to organisations at the forum, it seemed like a lot more organisations are just adding climate change as a strategic priority for their organisation. So it doesn't mean a massive it just, I think, is a bit of a shift in thinking, seeing how their core services are contributing to climate resilience, and then therefore making climate change a priority through that, and addressing those key drivers of vulnerability too. So yeah, I think maybe there's just more organizations who are prioritizing it now. Melissa, sorry, I saw you're off mute too.
Yeah, Melissa.
Sure, I just agree with what Ben has said, and I'll just add that I think challenges and barriers to collaboration were actually identified as part of this project, so it was within the scope. So a really good question, and I would just suggest that I think understanding these barriers that have been mentioned is really critical for resolving them. So we know from this project that some of the key findings were around barriers to capacity strengthening include, as has been touched upon, the short-term resourcing nature of things and project-based nature of work, and there can be a siloing of policy issues. But the project did also touch around key themes around collaborative relationships on climate justice, and important in that were things raised around, for example, competing organisational priorities and even the need for an authorising environment for collaboration, which is what this project enabled. So I'd just like to say that, despite these sort of barriers and associated considerations, you could say, I think there's much that can be achieved through this kind of joined up work, and there is a need for capacity strengthening most definitely, and organisational leadership and resourcing, and they were clearly identified as shared priorities for action. The other thing I would just throw in there is that community health and service organisations don't operate in a vacuum, so that we also need to understand the interdependencies with other organisations that drive these determinants of health. So these challenges and opportunities also carry across to fields like emergency management and urban design and transport and so on.
And I guess, look, unless Tess, you wanted to jump in, I could segue to some questions that have jumped up in relation to what Melissa just said. Tess, did you want to add anything, or?
I mean, I think Ben sort of earlier on hit the nail on the head. It's been written into our strategic priority planning, but it's hard to know exactly how to approach things from my perspective as a program coordinator. What can we actually do? But this has been really tangible.
Yeah. And look, just to sort of bring in some of that intersections, there's a couple of questions that speak to the role of, both the state and local governments and key actions that they can take up really in response to this project. But Melissa, you were just talking there about that intersection of working with and bringing those involved, in the drivers, if you like, of what creates the communities, the physical infrastructure or lack of physical infrastructure, depending. There's a question here from Darren, really, that is asking Darren Wilson, who's out at City of Greater Dandenong, talking about the key role of the state government and local government in this. And also a question from Michael, who really is kind of getting at the urban planning issues and challenges around the way in which we're developing outer areas. Melissa, did you want to just comment perhaps on some of the challenges in that space and opportunities perhaps?
Yes, happy to discuss the opportunities. I think commitment from all levels of leadership, so community, organisational as well as government, is needed obviously to support climate justice and adaptation planning to build, resilient and inclusive communities. What does that look like? I think development of leadership training materials and professional development opportunities for organisations such as ours and community health and service organisations could be a real key part of the enabling architecture, if you like, of this next piece. And I think also important is providing avenues to enable and support community leaders, of which we have many, to maximise impact within their own established networks, if that makes sense. So including people from migrant and refugee backgrounds, for example. After all, a place-based response is really one that's ideally characterised by these sort of, as you say, long-term co-design and co-governance and co-production sort of processes between not just government, but between community and stakeholders. So I'd just say that national and state leadership and policy and resourcing is really crucial to strengthening the capacity and enabling locally led action to address the drivers of these risks.
Thanks a lot, Melissa. And we have really some excellent questions that we're not going to get to, but we will try to follow up with some of the questions. Carolyn's asking, how do we embed Indigenous self-determination into this climate justice work? And that's something that we're very mindful of. And there's some fantastic organisations in the West working on a range of issues. So we've been connecting with Aboriginal community-controlled organisations and community hubs. So part of our ongoing work is really to strengthen that sort of collaboration. And we really do acknowledge the challenges that many have faced in engaging with this work and giving the time to it. And that really is one of the factors that we have to work on over the coming collaborative phases that we continue with. So I'm going to now begin to wrap up. I guess I just want to really acknowledge the time, given that we've been in a period where everyone is feeling stretched and fairly exhausted as a result of COVID and other challenges around cost of living, but also the recent floods and storm events. There's ongoing disruptions and risks that we are all experiencing. And I guess a key point to make is we are all vulnerable to the ongoing impacts of climate change, but we are really wanting to highlight that some communities are far more impacted than others. We really do want to acknowledge and thank all of the organisations that have been part of this project right from the beginning. And really, without their contribution and their insights, this collaborative action plan wouldn't have been brought together. And we really do see enormous amount of energy and drive in the networks that exist in the west of Melbourne and beyond, and joining this work up with a whole range of other initiatives that are currently going on. A lot of this is about joining the dots and joining up this work and strengthening the outcomes that way. So I'd just like to finish by thanking Julie and Catherine for launching and opening this event. Thanks so much to Tess, Ben and Melissa for their time on the panel, and we'll be sending out a follow-up email with links to the report and to find out more about the centre after this webinar. We really do thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to collaborating into the future. Thank you so much. And we're finishing on the dot of 12. And for all those who've asked questions and we couldn't get back to you, we'd love to follow up again after this. So thank you to everyone. Have a lovely day.